Buenas tardes, good afternoon, masal khair. Bienvenidos a esta nueva conferencia online de Casa Árabe. Es la cuarta del ciclo sobre los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, ODS, que estamos preparando este año en Oriente Medio y Norte de África, y que estará dedicada al objetivo número 5 en particular, que consiste en lograr la igualdad entre los géneros y empoderar a todas las mujeres y niñas. Forma parte también de las actividades que hacemos regularmente en Casa Árabe sobre temas de mujer y género a lo largo de todo el año, no solamente en el mes de marzo. Por ejemplo, tuvimos la presentación del libro Los feminismos ante el Islam hace apenas 9 días y ahora acabamos de abrir la exposición sobre mujeres del Sahel. Es un tema que tratamos también de forma transversal en todas nuestras actividades. Para tratar la sesión de hoy, que se trata de analizar, como comentaba, en la situación de la igualdad de género y el empoderamiento de las mujeres y las niñas en Oriente Medio y Norte de África, contamos con 3 ponentes excepcionales que se conectan hoy con nosotros desde Estados Unidos, desde Suecia y Portugal. Con lo que, para facilitar la comunicación con ellas, a partir de aquí vamos a desarrollar toda la sesión en inglés. Después de sus intervenciones y de la mesa redonda, podrán hacer sus preguntas, como en otras ocasiones, a través del chat, y ya sea en español o en inglés, y nosotros se las trasladaremos a las ponentes. Good evening. Welcome once more to Casa Árabe online roundtables. Today's session is the 4th in a series of roundtables dedicated to the Sustainable Development Goals in the MENA region, and will be dedicated to the goal number 5, which is gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. Despite the progress made in recent decades, particularly in terms of education and the legal status of women, the region has the largest gender gap in the world in many parameters. However, the situation is far from homogeneous, either between or within the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. And moreover, many factors are also putting at stake some of the advances that have been made in the previous decades, showing their fragility. After a decade of political change and transformations, the region at itself faces from the expansion of armed conflicts and the rise of ultra-conservative movements, to, for more than a year now, also the impact of the COVID-19, which, as in many other parts of the world, is also affecting the situation, work, and life of women in the region. All these are making women to be more exposed than ever to violence, disease, early marriages, and the deterioration of their education and career prospects. Given that we cannot touch upon all the diverse situations and contexts in the region, as we mentioned, we are going to focus today on the current situation of women in context of conflict and violence, and also during the COVID pandemic. To see first how and to what extent are women's development and rights in danger, or even going backwards in this context, and so also analyze what are the new challenges that women and girls are facing to achieve an effective implementation of this objective, SDG 5. To help us analyze this question, as mentioned, we will be joined on this occasion by 3 exceptional experts and activists on gender issues from Lebanon, Libya, and Yemen. Is Lina Abidafeh, which is Executive Director of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University. Asma Khalifa, which is a Libyan activist researching and the co-founder at the Tamazight Women's Movement. We have finally also Sama Al-Hamdani with us, which is the founder and executive director of the Yemen Cultural Institute for Heritage and Arts. So we'd like to welcome them and thank them a lot for connecting with us today. Really, thank you very much for making a little space in your busy agendas, which I know there, and especially for sharing your knowledge and experience working, researching, and fighting for women's rights and gender equality in the region. So let me introduce their work briefly. Lina Virafe is an expert in prevention and response to gender-based violence in humanitarian and emergency contexts. After completing her PhD at the London School of Economics, she published her research on gender and international aid in Afghanistan, the politics and effects of intervention. And then just to mention that in 2018 and then again in 2019, she was one of the 2 Arab women included in the Gender Equality Top 100, the most influential people in global policy list. Then we have Asma Khalifa, Asma Khalifa is a Libyan activist and researcher, as mentioned, who has worked on human rights, women's rights and youth empowerment since 2011. She has spent her career contributing to the building of Libya's civil society and has recently worked on peace building and conflict transformation in the country. For her efforts, she received the 2016 Luxembourg Peace Prize during the World Peace Forum in the European Parliament. And in 2017, she was named one of the 100 most influential young Africans by the African Youth Awards. Sama Al-Hamdani, in addition to being the executive director of the Yemen Cultural Institute for Heritage and Arts, is a non-resident analyst at the Middle East Institute, focusing on Yemen. And prior to that, she worked as a researcher at Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and at the Sana Center for Strategic Studies, specializing in transitional justice. So as you can see, as I mentioned, they're exceptional speakers, and it's a luxury to have them today for this debate about SDG 5 in the MENA region. We will organize the debate in 4 main blocks to take some questions later from the public at the end. So first we'll go a general introductory block to pass, and second block we'll tackle the issue of violence against women and women in conflict contexts, and a third one, the impact of COVID, and finally the last political developments and how they're affecting gender issues. So if we go to the block 1, which is the introductory one, as mentioned, the issue of gender have many dimensions and needs to take into account many different backgrounds and contexts in MENA and all around the world. So accordingly, the SDG 5 includes multiple approaches, from the protection of women in conflict to the possibility of deciding about their own bodies or the capacity to run a business. So in that sense, to start with this, given your diverse backgrounds and areas of expertise, as a kind of introduction, I would like to ask you, what does SDG 5 mean to you in relation to your areas of work? And from there, which aspects appear to you as more pressing for achieving SDG 5 in the MENA region from your perspective? And with this, you will have 5 minutes, more or less, each to answer, and then we will move to the second block of violence and conflict. So Lina, if you want to start, the floor is yours, and thanks again for doing this.
Thank you. I'm honored and delighted. I wish we could all be together, maybe next time. It's an important conversation to have, whether we're physical or virtual, because actually, as you rightly said, the Arab region is the worst in the world. You talked about the gender gap. There's 150 years until we close it. We are nowhere near. There's not a single Arab country that even made the top 100 in terms of the gender gap. We have challenges like protracted crises and major movements and displaced people and populations and marginalized groups, and COVID on top of that, and a resurgence of fundamentalist movements, and already the context of entrenched patriarchy and a massive backlash against women's rights and fundamental freedom. So here we bring SDG 5, which as the follow-up to the Millennium Development Goals now sounds like rhetoric, sounds like another a movement, a moment, or even worse, a UN acronym. So the challenge is with SDG 5, how do we make this meaningful to women and girls on the ground that we're not able to reach otherwise? How do we make this something that, for me, is more than just a conversation that we all have where we know the lingo, and I even have my mug. I even have my SDG 5 mug to tell you that we're so entrenched in this language and in this effort, but if we're not unpacking it and contextualizing it and demonstrating to women and girls at the absolute grassroots level, in every place, at every stage, that this is something important, that it refers to their very own rights, their own voice and choice and bodily integrity and autonomy, then what are we doing? We end up just writing reports and regurgitating information that is, I want to say abstract, also can be elitist. So when I talk about these kinds of things, at least with me, now in an academic institute, I'm no longer on the ground in the way that I used to be in humanitarian emergencies on the front line. But what does this mean to the young women who are a part of the structure where I work? What does it mean to people who don't use this kind of lingo? And I try to avoid all of the jargon. But for me, you asked what's the most important. And I would say it's freedom from violence, because the fact that violence against women and girls continues in the home, in school, at work, on the streets, in the market, in every single place and space, in every single time period, and for a range of reasons, for me is unacceptable. And it renders all the other rights moot. You can give me a quota for women's representation in parliament, important. You can make sure that there are family-friendly workplace policies, important. You can make sure that girls have access to education, important. All of it is important. But if I am not safe going to and from school, work, and I'm not safe in my home, in my body, in my own life, with the ability to decide what to do with it, then none of those things are important. So for me, this is the fundamental starting point and the non-negotiable. Because actually the rates of violence against women in the region are very high. They're high everywhere globally. This is the biggest crime of our time, frankly, and just about every country, every space, every historic period, every conflict or peace or whatever we're in, there's always an excuse to inflict violence against women. And this is something, for me, I don't accept. And you can imagine in a place like the Arab region where the systems, the structures, the services, the reporting, the shelters, the safe spaces, all of these are scant, very, very little. And even then there's shame and stigma and the blame and it's your fault and what were you wearing and all the cultural baggage that we have to take on to be able to address this issue. So we are very far from it. And even the statistics, which I put very little faith in, underestimate the reality. We know it is much worse than any of the numbers show. So for me, this is what sets off a bomb in my heart and what I would like to see us resolve before we take on anything else. I'll leave it there for now and continue with the next questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lina, because that also links with the second block, so it's perfectly said. So if I can summarize it, you basically said that the important thing will be to reach girls and women in the ground, basically make something that is substantial for them, really can change their life. In the sense that we have to do something is to make sure they are safe, isn't it? So, I mean, then later, if you want, in the next blog, we can talk about what kind of violence is it that they are suffering, and then we can develop more. So, Asma, if you want to take the floor now, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again.
Well, it's great to speak after Lina because she speaks well and covers most points. I think what I would say is what's important for us also when it comes to SGP5 is to have also infrastructure of services that is accessible to all women. It's violence against women in the region and where the most unsafe places are is at home. And there are no services. Well, in Libya, there are none services to report, to document. It's extremely dangerous to research even and try to interview, because there is, as Lina spoke about, the stigma of speaking on violence. It's the fathers, it's the sons, it's the husbands, it's the brothers. It's not something easy that you could report and talk about. There's no infrastructure in the health care services in Libya when it comes to addressing gender-based violence and sexual gender-based violence. In 2019, we were part of the debate at the Security Council on sexual violence during war. And the response of the Libyan government at the time was to intimidate us by sending a letter to the Security Council about us specifically. It's so we shouldn't even talk about it. Another one that is very important is the protection of women. Women, not just women in general, but women advocates, human rights activists, politicians. If we are not safe and secure to work on these issues, then there's no possibility to do it. It's not possible to try to raise awareness or advocate or change laws and regulations when you're not sure if you're going to live through to continue this work. And in war, and in context of violence, that's extremely exaggerated. I don't think it's actually much worse in war than in other contexts in the country, of the regions. Women do get assassinated and targeted because they speak out all over, even in there is no war. And then inclusion of women in all at all levels. Well, in Libya it would be the peace process and the rebuilding of the country, because that's how you prevent future violence to happen, is by having women who know about sensitive gender policies, about laws and regulations, and how to have this infrastructure to exist, so that women in the future could benefit from that.
Thanks a lot, Asma, because that connects very well also with Lina. If I make the connection, if Lina said that the important thing is to keep women safe, you're going more into details in terms of, if we need to keep women safe and protect women, then you have to work on the infrastructures and services, that allow for that, in terms of recording violence, and also in terms of providing the health services to recollect those data and attend them, and also to protect those women that are leading the way in terms of the advocacy or politicians that are working to make those changes possible, and also and then the third point you mentioned is like the inclusion of women in the peace building and processes, and also in the process of rebuilding the countries, which is in context of conflicts, I guess is the key issue, because it will be what will define the future. So thanks a lot, because then we can continue also speaking about that in the second block. And so now, Sama, thanks a lot for connecting with us. We really appreciate that you are here with us today. So if you want to intervene also and tell us what do you think are the priorities on what doesn't the SDG 5 means for in your area of work. I had what we just mentioned. Thank you very much. We don't hear you. Let's see.
Hi.
Okay.
Is it working now? Thank you so much, Olivia. I was just saying hello to you and to the other two speakers. I would like to thank them for setting the tone for this discussion. I also would like to thank the people watching us. I don't have a very clear chain of thought on the subject because it's so vast and wide, but I do feel that the subject is, in a sense, a buzzword, like Lina had kind of mentioned earlier, that it's part of this UN lingo that you want to enforce on a region. These are the goals that we want to have. Although I do appreciate that it is number 5 out of 16 or 17 other goals, which means that it is essential, in a sense, to connect into all the other ones. However, I do not entirely appreciate that the UN is leading that effort. I do think that sometimes, and especially in Yemen's case, they are very much part of the the problem. So while they want to promote and champion women's rights, in a sense, sometimes they issue Security Council resolutions that ensure the continuation of conflict and sometimes support certain processes on the ground that make us and keep us away from achieving these goals. And this is a personal criticism, of course. I don't think that people on the panel share that opinion with me and might, in fact, have opinions to the opposite. I think when it comes to women specifically in the region and in the Gulf, in the Arabian Peninsula, and in Yemen specifically, it's been kind of a slow winning war for women. In Yemen's case, women had a lot of educational opportunities. They were able to step in and kind of participate in society. But what the war did is not just keep things where they are, it actually regressed and it reversed it. And today, women are in far worse shape than ever before. So they are not safe, they are not secure. It touches on the subject of violence that the other two speakers touched on, but also they are oppressed by their own people. So even if they're safe, we've talked about the idea of women being suppressed by family members, but then today what we're seeing in Yemen is two states on the ground, multiple governments all holding on to fundamentalism with a strong focus on what women are wearing, what women are doing, what women are saying. And it seems to be uniform across the board, regardless of what their faith is or what they're looking at. It seems that the focus on women continues to be about control and about oppression, and it continues to go back into subjects that I thought we've surpassed globally. The ideas of virginity, chastity. The focus continues to be on women who work in the political sphere or in the public eye, to shame them in this regard in order to discipline and punish them and bring them back home where they are quieter, where they are disciplined to be housewives. However, in Yemen's case, I'd like to say that poverty is an incredibly powerful component here to how the lives of these women are. Poverty means that this woman is potentially, in a sense, sold at a very young age in exchange for money that could help the family out. So you have child marriages as a byproduct of severe poverty and of severe hunger. Families have to kind of treat their children that way. You have issues where in Yemen, the average family size it used to be 7.5. It's probably a lot larger today. So you have the woman who would then bear, 7 children at least, taking care of, she being a child herself, taking care of children in a war circumstance where she doesn't have access to education, nor will her children have access to education, to healthcare. It's just everything is set up against women in Yemen specifically, I would say, and also in the region it's quite challenging, but in Yemen particularly so. Everything seems to be going backwards. And so when I sit on a panel and I want to discuss UN goals, and they just changed them to include the word sustainable, because we adjust them to fit in with what we're trying to do moving forward. It's so difficult and challenging to take it on seriously. And even on the elite level, where women are educated and where women has had representation in political parties, in governments, things have regressed, where Yemen, for the first time, the last government that they've created does not include a single woman. So for many years, Yemen has had women in government, and now they have taken a step back even on that level. However, in contrast to the fact that women hold no political power whatsoever and are a lot of times tokenized by political parties to have just a woman figure who then works for the party, we also have all this funding coming in from European nations, from the West, that wants to only fund and support women's programs in the region. And this polarity, in a sense, between women not actually having any power, but then the Western world adamant and strong into supporting programs that fund the inclusion of women. There's a big question mark in the back of my head of where does that money go, and why aren't women now in positions of power if that is in fact what the West is supporting in the region? Of course, I think there are many answers and theories as to why that is happening. And I think in a sense, we can all agree that there's a system that is broken. And ultimately, the question is not for the Western donors to answer. It's actually for grassroots movements, for women on the ground to have a seat at the table and to kind of have the seat that they deserve in order to create the influence they want in their own societies. I think there's this schism that I think we can address in the next subjects. And I'm actually eager to delve into the subject of violence, although I am not an expert on violence. So again, I just like to thank the previous two speakers for setting the tone, because it raises all these questions that I have when I want to talk about the subject of gender equality in the region, and specifically to Yemen. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sama, because indeed you also raised many questions that are kind of going to lead our discussion. I think it was very good that you kind of introduced also within the issue of safety of the woman, how we have to put a kind of nuance that even when women are safe, no, there are other kinds of control and oppression, and we can talk about different kinds of violence in that framework later. And also, thank you very much for introducing the issue of poverty and the issue also of the demographics, how it's affecting also the situation in Gulf, and how, when in the Gulf, how you have portrayed the difference between some countries in the region and maybe the actual situation of the majority of population in Yemen now, which is completely different than what is in the other countries of the world, and has also including the aspect of inclusion and the idea of the international program that we can tackle on later also if you want it in the debate. So thanks a lot. So then if you want, we can move then to the issue of violence and conflict, which is the second round of questions. And it will be the impact of violence, either gender-based violence or conflicts on women and on women and girls, and other kinds of different kinds of violence. We can enter now into details and how this is affecting gender equality and women empowerment in the region. How can we move towards the implementation of CDG 5? And we're speaking, I mean, I think we all agree on what you mentioned about the UN terminology. I mean, at least for us, it's an excuse to talk about gender equality and women empowerment. We will be talking, in any case, about this, even if it's not because of it wouldn't be named SDG 5, but it's the excuse to talk about it. But whatever. How can we move towards the implementation of gender equality and empowering of women in context of conflict and humanitarian crisis? And then which are the main challenges in these conflicts, and especially which are the priorities? So as you mentioned some of them already, so you can develop on that. Which do you think should be the strategies that need to be taken to implement to empower a woman or give them or include them in this context? Lina, if you want, you can. You have worked on violence, on gender-based violence in the humanitarian and emergency context. So if you would like to talk a bit about it and about which are the factors and challenges that those situations create and how to alleviate those vulnerabilities, and maybe explain a bit what do you think also in relation to the international programs or international aid, how this paradox that Sama commented, if you can develop also on that based on your work on the Afghanistan conflict. Thank you, Lina. You have also 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Olivia. Building on what everybody else has already said, in humanitarian contexts, a bad situation becomes so much worse. So, we know that there's so many vulnerabilities already. Certainly in the Arab region, we're talking about protracted crises that last not for years or decades, but literally for generations. I don't need to tell you, Yemen and Iraq and Syria and, certainly now Palestine with everything that is happening. This continues, and for women and girls, they really bear the brunt of these crises. My experience for about 2 decades was working on preventing and responding to sexual violence in humanitarian emergencies, which I say I never succeeded anywhere, clearly, because the emergencies continue and sexual violence continues. So it has to be the most frustrating job in the world that should never actually have been a job, because ending sexual violence, as I've said many times, should be common sense and not a career. But in fact, here we are. And the places I worked, places like Afghanistan, like you said, Olivia, Mali, Haiti, Nepal, Niger, Papua New Guinea with emergency-like conditions. In all of these, the very basic non-negotiables about women's safety, and I think Sana mentioned it, Asma also, the idea that women are not safe, and are they safe? No. What is it going to take to make them safe? So when I would speak to women and girls with the very limited power that I had, because I really had none, I was part of a gigantic aid apparatus, working with the UN or with another entity, working as the so-called GBV coordinator of whatever humanitarian response we were in the middle of, asking women, are you safe? And they would say no. And what would it take? And they would answer, and I would try and deliver on those things, or at least advocate for those things. And very often it was simple things, and it was lighting, and it was latrines, and it was economic empowerment as well, opportunities to get them out of the camps or shelters or makeshift spaces where they were living, how they could be safe, how they could get back on their own feet, how they could support themselves and their families. Again, we add to this context that is very complicated the risk of sexual exploitation and abuse that we perpetrate, violating our own duty of care, right? We're talking about people who are in the aid community, people who are in positions of power and decision making, peacekeepers. Every single country, every single emergency, every single time, there will be bodies, male, who take advantage of the positions of power they find themselves in by preying on the vulnerabilities of women and girls to say, oh, you have a family to support, you need rations of food, you need this and that, well, show me how badly you want it. And I see that it's repulsive. So what would be the solutions to all of this? Well, I think also, as has been mentioned, the idea of looking at women's organizations that were there before, that will be there after, that are working in the context, that know what they are doing, that are reaching the right people at the right time in the right place with the right programs. But what do? We ignore those people far too often, and I say that collectively for all of us as we're implicated in perpetuating this. The idea that we say, well, they can't absorb the funding, or they don't have the reach, or they don't have the capacity, or they don't this. So we come in and we kind of bring all of this, the circus, as I like to call it. And then, and only now in recent years, do we start talking about what we have called the localization agenda, right? Here comes another buzzword, so be prepared. The localization agenda means, what I think is intuitive to all of us, is that women and girls and organizations should be the ones that are leading the charge, should be the ones that receive the full funding and have the ability to dictate it. As somebody who came from the UN and moved into the so-called local partner, right? The Arab Institute for Women is a local academic institute. Seeing the way that the funding modality changed and the way people address us and deny our expertise and our contextual understanding and our ability to make change and make gains that are meaningful and relevant to the lives of women and girls, to me is shocking. So I can speak very easily from both sides, because now I wear these two hats. And the idea that our funding mechanisms, I call them accordion funding, because we're given funding for a certain project, for a certain time period, for a donor dictated agenda from somebody who's sitting in Geneva, where I have been 100 times, so I understand. And we are told what to do, how to do it, and how to report on it. So I spend all of my time reporting to a donor who has said to me, wow, your English is so good. Anyway, we can talk about that another time. But all that to say that we have to expand our tiny team to be able to absorb this funding, to fulfill this mandate, to meet a donor requirement, to produce yet another report that's going to sit in a pile. And at the same time, when the funding goes away, we shrink back. And, an accordion, it's not my favorite sound, right? It expands and it contracts, and we're never able to do anything that is sustainable. No one funds our operating costs. No one funds the core business. No one gives us money and says, you know what to do with it. And I find that to be absolutely ironic. And speaking about Afghanistan, and here I will end, speaking about Afghanistan, when I went to set up an international NGO working with women in 2002 in Afghanistan, the comments were very much the same. The Afghan women were saying, why don't you just let us run this? And what you're actually doing by making all these big promises and calls for liberation and claiming to support women's rights is in effect provoking a backlash. And if you all just take your good intentions and park them and listen to us, and we will tell you exactly what to do. And literally, I have the book in front of me. Because of everything that's going on in Afghanistan, I literally wrote damn book about it, because I was like, this is not even, like, I don't know what to say anymore. I don't know how much I can scream. I'm losing my voice. So the idea that we fail to listen to women, and here we are now talking about US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and have we met any of the promises we've made to women? Have we delivered? You know, this was 2002 that I came in, and the intervention and all of the big circus for Afghanistan. 2006 I left. 2009 I published the book. And what has changed, and what year are we now? And I am afraid that every single conflict and every single context is going to follow suit, because we don't seem to learn any of the lessons that we claim to brand and buzzword. So localization, I will leave you with that.
Thanks a lot, Lina. Again, and thanks also for introducing the issue of power, which maybe we can talk about later, and the abuse of positions of power. We can maybe talk about that later. And well, we move then. There are many things we can develop later if you want. Let's give the floor now to Asma. Asma, growing up as a non-Arab, I'm a Sikh Libyan under the rule of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. You said to have witnessed the negative impact of discrimination and violence against women. So since then, you have been working also on the violence against women, as well as on peace building through working with civil society movements, as we mentioned in Libya, from a Tamasik women movement. So that the movement that you co-founded. So in that sense, could you tell us in this context a bit more about the context of violence against women in Libya previous to the regime change and now, and which are their demands and priorities of the women movements, and which kind of strategies and actions are taken, and are they pushing for there? Thanks a lot.
Well, I'll give a little bit of a setting on how as Libyan civil society organizations sprang up in 2011 in a context of already civil war. There has been no independent civil society organization throughout the 42 years of Gaddafi's era, as Amazigh women were not supposed to exist, completely erased from society. So and now 10 years through a civil war, you never think things will get worse, but every year it does. We moved from already 2011, 2012, trying to push for better representation of women and pushing for more progressive policies and gender sensitive laws, to in 2014 going underground, unable to do any work in public. Basically, you do any number of workshops or seminars or awareness campaigns under the guise of different names. You try and pick and choose the safest neighborhood you could do it, that you cannot be raided. And the conflict in Libya is very gendered, right? Men have the military power, the political power, the economic power, the social power. So you try to operate within these different really narrow spaces that continue to narrow. And then, of course, you have a perpetual transitional government that tries to control, it tries to contain, and of course maintain a status quo of profiting from war and conflict and all these layers where women do not exist in. So it's our agenda basically constantly changes. We do not make long-term plans or strategies because you cannot do that, and war sets the tone. So in 2016, I remember we were advocating for the women to be included in the UN peace process, which at the time the UN was completely responsible for, inviting those to attend, and they've only invited 2 women. Because, as Sama has said, the system is broken. The system is about bringing, the naughty boys to the table to discuss how to stop the bombing. It's not about how to make peace. So, of course, women would not be there because women are not bombing. And then we worked on, so we stopped working at all at the national level because it does not exist. It's split. There's 2 governments in the country. We started working more on women in local government, so in municipalities, to see how they would implement better gender policies, at least from their small budgets and different issues. And what we found in that first project that we've done as Tamazight Women Movement is, interestingly, all the crisis committees are run by women. All of the legwork, the hard work, the gritty work of addressing the internally displaced camps, of humanitarian assistance, coordinating international organization, is done by women, but none of the decisions are. And when I ask the women, well, if you are doing all of the legwork, why are you not making decisions? And they said, well, the men are making that while having tea in the middle of the night, playing cards. So of course we can't. We are excluded from that kind of space, and so we have tried to give more capacity building on how to ambush men during office hours when they manage to try to exert more their agendas. We've also been trying to do more documentation and coordination for gender-based violence services among organizations. The Libyan government does not provide any sort of services, so it's left to civil society organizations to fill the gap in providing services to women, or international organizations. We have been doing focus groups in trying to see how we can address this issue, and it's not yet something that we can unpack aside from raising awareness and trying to, as I said, we can't have services when the security sector completely is run by militias and armed groups and external foreign fighters and mercenaries. I mean, what am I going to establish? A hotline? So who's going to come rescue anyone? And what if the woman's partner himself is part of the system, which is the case like that. Almost all of femicide cases last year in Libya of women killed by their partners. Their partners were previous fighters. So you also have then issues of PTSD and mental health issues that a population is struggling with, that is not addressed. So what do? We do work either completely with municipalities, or we do advocacy on the international and regional level, but we do not at all engage. We did not before this spring, but we did not before at all engage with the national level. And what are the priorities? Or I can stop. What are the priorities? Well, the priority for the population is to reconcile, right? To stop the war, fix the system, fix the infrastructure. If you ask an average Libyan person, they would say, we want electricity, we want liquidity in the financial system, we want employment, we want jobs, we want to go back our homes if they're displaced, we want the militias to stop living in our neighborhoods. The demands will be as little as sometimes I want to be able to go to school or university without having to coordinate where or when these bombs will fall.
Thanks a lot, Asma. That's an impressive recount as well. Lina was mentioning about we have failed listening to women, and it seems that in Libya they're not listening either. You mentioned that the conflict is very, very gender based, and but what is curious to say that you said that the women don't send the bombs, but they're the ones that are managing the crisis, at the end of the humanitarian crisis that they are managing. And I think that's also something that could be applied to other parts of the world. And again, we are talking about how to include them in the decision making, because they suffer the consequences, but they are not hurt at the moment of finding a solution or taking decisions at the highest political level. So just to change a bit the atmosphere, I mean, I'm going to go back to Sama to see if she could speak us a bit about the projects she was involved on, about arts as a tool for peace building. You participated. That was a Women in Conflict Fellowship pilot program. So could you explain us a bit more about that, and how In the sense, we introduce a new dimension for what has been said about what is the potential both of arts and then the women in arts in peace building. I don't know if you can develop a bit more and share your ideas about that with us. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Before I answer that question, I would like to kind of add a little bit to what Lina and specifically Esma had said, because ended her discussion by saying, what do the people want during this time? And the list of demands is similar in most war zones. And I just want to add this emphasis that there's no way that we can work on improving the status of women and children while there's a war taking place. It's very basic. However, we have all these systems and regimes trying to, manage the war while doing things that are good for women and children. And it just does not work that way, because a huge chunk of society that is affected by the war are women and children. And until the war is stopped, we really cannot, in my opinion, do anything real for a woman that we can build on, that is sustainable. The buzzword of sustainability here. You cannot achieve that during war. However, this raises another question of we're now in a world that is extremely global and extremely connected, and we are jumping from one crisis to the next, and our attention is shifting from one country to the other. And in a sense, there's this idea that war brings a lot of focus to a region, which means that potentially the focus on women and children in Yemen now is at its highest level because of the conflict. What does that mean if the war ends? Does that focus shift away, and does that funding go to the next crisis at play? And I think, and I want to touch on what Lina said earlier, that she has worked as part of this international humanitarian work, and she's also worked as a local on the ground with locals. And I think that the real issue is in the design of the system. And the best way to fix the design of that system is to include women of color from the regions that people are working on in the decision-making processes, in the process where they are shaping a mechanism, they are creating a strategy, a device. The fact that ultimately you have P5 countries at the UN with women who are mostly American or British or somewhere from Europe deciding what is best and how to best spend the money in a region they know nothing about, they have nothing in common with women in that region, with the exception of just being women, that isn't enough to help the system work correctly. And so those are really my additions and thoughts on the previous discussion. And I'm happy to talk now about the role of art. We have a term in Arabic that says أضعف الإيمان, which means the weakest faith. And I think that art ultimately comes for me as the only way to talk about peace without having to do it in a political way. Hello?
Yeah.
My
We hear you.
for a second. I just want to make sure.
We hear.
So, there are multiple channels of how to talk about peace. Obviously, there's the official processes that are taking place where women can participate. And ever since 2016, like I mentioned, women have not been able to take part of that, regardless of how much they pushed, regardless of the fact that many civil society organizations are led, managed, and are successfully working compared to ones led by men. Women have failed to just really influence the peace process in the way that they should be able to. And so when you have multiple tools before you and many issues that are being used as a political tool, so for example, the issue of gender, the issue of art, the issue of culture, they're all politicized, meaning that I will use the issue of gender to reach my goal if I want. And I think men do that a lot of times, and I think they do it with art and other things. But here, in my approach with it in Yemen, which hasn't been that impactful, unfortunately. However, it has had impact in the diaspora and in raising awareness about Yemen's war and about giving individuals tools to have a say, to express themselves, to regain their confidence, and to assert the demand for peace that is often muted. There are a few challenges here. One, I wanted to take art and depoliticize it in a sense, even though it is the most political thing to say that I want peace. I'm saying that I want to take art away from propaganda and have it be a real tool in the hands of artists who can then vocalize their demands, because art can also be a tool for propaganda. And so there's that divide that I want to make. And then two, the voices of Yemenis in the diaspora, and I am one of those voices because I cannot. I've had the privilege to escape the war in Yemen, and I don't think that I would be able to do this kind of work from within Yemen, in the midst of bombing, in the midst of killing, in the midst of fundamentalism. In the diaspora, it is possible for us to get together and amplify our voices, our demands for peace, so that we can eventually do this in our own home countries, so that we can eventually carry this tool of peace back in and celebrate it. And I think when I talk about art in the Middle East and art specifically in Yemen, the Yemeni culture is so rich and embellished with so many incredible tools that I think to a Western eye, or even to a foreign eye looking at Yemen, the richness of the culture, the fact that Yemen has unique architecture, the fact that we have unique music, dance, that the culture is so rich with it and that it is part of our daily lives, doesn't come through in this war. All you see are weapons, killings, stories about children who are soldiers. And I think art is a really strong way to celebrate our culture, our heritage, to stay connected to where we come from, and to use that as a tool to be empowered and to say, hey, I have power. I haven't lost everything that makes me me. Everything that makes me me is not blood and violence. It is other things as well. And so within the Cultural Institute, we've run programs, we've run discussions at universities, but we've also done a lot of performances, interfaith performances that include and involve Yemenis in the diaspora and Western audiences as a tool to communicate and connect with each other, as a tool to dehumanize the people that are dying every day in the conflict, as a way to make the war a bit more of a real thing to audiences who've never experienced war in their life. And so there are many tools for it. And I think, it's to tie it back to the issue of women. I've met the most impressive, most talented, most intelligent women who have managed to use art as a fighting tool, as a way to say, hey, I reject all of this violence against me, and this is me, and this is what I can do. Not only am I defending myself with it, I am speaking up on behalf of all these other women, and I am going to continue to do so because that is my craft. And so I hope that answered the question, and I refrained from mentioning a lot of the work because I think I can really drown everyone who's watching in the subject about it.
Thanks a lot. I'm sure not. Thanks a lot, because I think it's very, very important what you mentioned, because we were speaking about women not being heard and not being listened. And in that sense, art is a way of raising the voices, as you mentioned, no? And also has different dimensions, because it's a way of raising the voice. It's a way of celebrating the culture, no? And also helping to, what you mentioned, feeling better, more comfortable, the issue of mental health that was commented before. And also, we are speaking about empowering. Art is a way of empowering the women, no? And also fighting tool, as you mentioned. So I think it's very important. And what you said about through art, raising awareness via the diaspora, no, I think is key. Thanks a lot for those comments. I wanted us to talk a bit. To top it up. You were mentioning that we cannot talk about gender equality while the war is on. No, it's impossible to advance on that. And to top it up, we have the COVID. No, we were when we were talking about preparing the roundtable, Asma was commenting that things were worse enough, and then the COVID came, but things were already very, very bad. No, but if you can dedicate just a kind of short comments about how do you think the COVID is impacting also the situation of women in the region, and if it's changing somehow? Lina was commenting how really is changing the way we perceive each other and the position of also this kind of connection between the professional and the domestic. This is mixing everything, and whatever you think it would be interested to raise and how it's changing that situation. So Lina, if you want to take the floor again, and also focus on this, you mentioned the need for a feminist response to COVID, no, and how it's impacting Arab women and girls. So the floor is yours also.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. I think COVID has made a bad situation worse in so many ways, and globally, so not just in the Arab region, but all around the world, there's been an increase in terms of intimate partner violence. There's been a decrease, obviously, in terms of economic opportunity for women, in terms of representation, in terms of space and access. Women are always and will continue to be the first to be fired, the last to be hired, the ones who are the most easily dismissed in the context of work, which is detrimental. It's literally setting the feminist movement back generations. The challenge of girls going to school and now limited access, already somewhat precarious, increase in child marriage and other forms of violence. Child marriage being from the parents' perspective a way to kind of offload an economic burden, but also protect girls, as it were, to be able to make sure they're still virgins when they get married, because God forbid, this is clearly the most important thing. Increase in cases of female genital mutilation. For women and girls, the situation has been terrible. Even in New York, just let me share a small anecdote since I am here in New York City. We subscribe to a text messaging service that gives us updates on the situation. So last March 2020, the first few days, we're getting texts every day, stay at home, stay safe. And that was the consistent messaging for about the first 6 weeks of the pandemic. Following that, somebody else must have gotten hold of the texting system, and the messaging changed. And it started to say, we understand that home might not be safe for everyone. And if it is not safe for you, call this number, do this, seek support, tell someone, whatever. But the point is this, that it took 6 weeks of the assumption that home is safe and that it should be safe, because absolutely it should be. But it isn't. It isn't for many women and girls. It has exacerbated already precarious situations of intimate partner violence and created even new forms of violence. So finally, people got the idea that this was messaging that was done in ignorance. And so they had to actually consider what was happening to the safety of women and girls. And anyway, that's New York. And that didn't happen anywhere else. Not to mention, the burden of care and the unpaid labor, and women as the frontline workers, and women caring for the elderly and the sick, and women in healthcare, and it goes on and on. But the conversation we had, Olivia, before that I'm going to touch on very briefly is, what is the silver lining of what has been a terrible situation for women worldwide? It's hard to find a silver lining, but I would say what has been interesting and could potentially be important is a couple of things. First of all, the idea that for women who are able to work, this creates by default a more family-friendly work arrangement. You can work from home. You have your home and your professional life integrated in better ways. You can look after your child or your home or whatever other responsibilities while you are on a work call. This idea that we used to operate with an artificial segregation of professional and personal life, for me, has never actually worked. There was nothing magical about 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. where nothing personal ever happens to you. So finally, the idea that we can have all of these aspects of our lives, here we are, we're having this conversation, and you're sitting, you can see my kitchen. There is an integration of what is personal and professional that I think is so refreshing. The other aspect that I certainly hope will happen, and maybe has happened, I don't know how much for the Arab, how much it will happen for the Arab region, but in other places, the hope is that the burden of care that falls disproportionately on women and girls will now be shared a little bit by men and boys, because they are existing at home, sharing the space, and understanding what it takes to run the household and manage the family and do all of these things that have been historically women's work. There's nothing special about my hands that makes them better at washing dishes than anybody else. And this idea, very much kind of Arab and other cultural contexts of the rare enlightened man who helps you with the dishes is laughable, because those are actually his dishes too. So finally, this integration of everybody in the same space, which probably has driven us all a bit nuts, could potentially lead to a more equitable division of domestic labor. That could be a long-term result. It certainly is something that in the Arab region we will continue to fight for, in the hopes that people understand that women are need to have active professional, productive economic lives, and men are just as capable of handling absolutely everything on the domestic front. And I certainly hope they step up and start doing it.
Thanks a lot, Lina, for this. At least in these two messages of hope. Let's hope at least if we don't get gender equality in other issues, at least a bit at the domestic level, and the COVID brings a bit of that. So if you would like to comment also on the impact on COVID, asthma, maybe you could explain also. I mean, you were the one mentioning how really it comes as kind of in already a very difficult situation in Libya. So would you like to comment a bit more about how, I mean, you were mentioning also about the different strategies you are taking with local governments and things of crisis management and the municipalities. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about how the COVID also is in that agenda, or in the actions that women movements are taking there. I know you could talk about that.
Thank you. Well, COVID arrived to Libya that has had a health sector that's been collapsing for years, an economic sector that has been collapsing, and of course you have annual budget after annual budget, hundreds of millions of dollars, all given into the military and the security sector. And in fact, when COVID arrived in March 2020, Tripoli was still being under attack. And I traveled to Tripoli actually just before in the beginning of March, just for work, and and of course work didn't happen, but I arrived before the lockdown, and so I was in lockdown in my family's home, where there was a strict curfew, a no movement curfew, and of course it was implemented by having these militias patrol streets, etc. And you could think about air raids, bombing, hospitals that are targeted, power cuts. If something happens, well, my family's home thankfully was not so close to the front lines, but we heard these horrific stories of people who tried to flee in the middle of the night, but were restricted because there was a curfew. They didn't know where to go because they could not mix with other people. And in April 2020, one of the hospitals that was given a budget and was equipped to handle COVID cases was bombed. It was thankfully was not completely destroyed, but the maternity ward was destroyed, and there was a woman there who was giving birth right in the middle of the room where the bomb has fallen. It was an extraordinary story because, of course, the medical staff was all in panic and trying to move away, and she continued her work and delivered a child. They're both alive. But what COVID came to was, in fact, people, besides the panic of the first few months, did not really pay much attention to it. There was not so much as a concern of what COVID would do when you're not safe, when you're not secure, when your country is in shambles, when you don't have the financial means to move. And of course, those impacted more severely are women who will be now stuck with their abusers inside their houses. I mentioned the cases of femicide. They were all happening after a lockdown. Women will not be just doing housework. They will also be teachers. They'll be assistants. They will do the job of what schools are doing. Women in pink collar jobs, in the service industry, and all the other jobs which shut down during COVID are all impacted. And because culturally and socially, women are not viable adults, their credit system, if they don't have men, is destroyed. So female internally displaced population who do not have husbands and fathers and sons to vouch for them when they're renting places and moving places and finding jobs, they were kicked out on the streets, because who will pay the rent if you are not working? Who is going to speak for you? Who's going to vouch for you? There's no protection for such women. So it's and of course, as everyone knows, Libya is also a migration and human trafficking and slavery hub. And you could imagine, probably not, we can't imagine the situation for migrant women during COVID. So yes, COVID came and it was complete. It was already a complete disaster that it just complicated everything. We tried last year to petition with the government. We've sent them recommendations. We've sent them requests on how to improve the condition. For instance, how they could account for the internally displaced population and give special financial support to women-led households. How they can need to have backup plans and help unemployed people because of the COVID and pink and blue collar jobs. Unfortunately, I mean, corruption did not come by war, right? It was quite there, entrenched ages ago. So the government would do committees, they would allocate budgets that would never reach the population. And that's another massive issue that we have in the region. I think even when there is a way to advocate and create some sort of system that responds, it doesn't mean that it will, because it's corrupt.
Thanks a lot, Asma. That's an impressive testimony of COVID under bombs, no, and being in curfew in those circumstances. And thanks a lot for raising the issue of well, you raised many different issues. Also, one is the migration issue, which is something that we have to take into consideration, and situation of migrants in those contexts, and also women migrants. And one of the issues of the financial support, and also the issue of corruption. We were mentioning before also in terms of the problem, how the money to reach the objective it really was meant to. And you, I mean, corruption is, we thought, I mean, I think also one of the SDG goals, or in some of them, we thought to take it one, and it's a difficult, as you said, it was before the war, it was, and it's a very, very difficult issue to tackle. We can talk about that in another moment, or if you want to develop more about that. So thanks a lot. Sam, I don't know if you want to, you already were mentioning also about the situation of, and the difficult situation of Yemen. I guess it's a bit similar to what Asma was commented, and you were already explaining a bit, but I don't know if you want to add some impressions about that, about how the impact of COVID is also changing the way we perceive each other, and maybe also in your experience with the Yemeni diaspora. Maybe you can tell us a bit how it's also changing the way we perceive the situation of women, or how we perceive each other. The voice again. I think you okay. Yeah. No. Let's see. I think you mute yourself. Can you click again to see? This is, yeah.
Does this work now?
Yeah, working. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was saying, yes, indeed, you are correct that a lot of what's happening in Yemen is in fact similar to what's happening in Libya, in the sense that the medical facilities in Yemen were already near collapse, or actually collapsed in some places. And what COVID did is came in an entirely exhausted and already weak medical system. What's interesting in Yemen's case is that the community and the culture and the people refused to acknowledge the presence of COVID-19, and they live their lives on a daily basis as if nothing is happening. In order to protect oneself, it's a very individualistic choice by certain families who've taken the measures to stay at home, wear masks. However, when you're in a society and a culture that is very intertwined. Most households have multiple family members, from the grandmother to the grandchildren, living together. A lot of them are not taking any self-isolation measures, social distancing measures, and it makes controlling or limiting the effects of COVID-19 really difficult. I'm going to be very frank here. A lot of the people that I talked to, it sounds like they had COVID at least twice at this point. A lot of the people that I've talked to, a lot of times, if a family is educated enough, they would keep the elderly away. They would try to put measures in place to constantly clean the house. And the burden of keeping a house clean and disinfected always lies on the woman's hand. And interestingly enough, we also have a lot of the hospitals, the healthcare workers are women. A lot of the pieces that have been coming out of Yemen on healthcare, the people spending, sacrificing their lives, staying on the line, a lot of them have been women. And I think it's really important to highlight the resilience of women during conflict in circumstances where everything is already working against them, but for them to still take positions of leadership is quite challenging. So for COVID, like I said, it's quite difficult. It's quite challenging. And also, while I think Lena's perspective on COVID, she really did see the glass is half full perspective, because sometimes I think when you come from a culture where marriage is not your choice and to have children is not your choice, sometimes spending your whole day with children when they could have been at a school is actually taking that space that you can have with yourself to process, to center, to be able to continue a day's work. Of course, it's difficult to think that way, but that is unfortunately the reality in some people's lives, where they need that space from their children a little bit so they can flourish in other aspects in life, and to not be constantly the woman who's also a mother, because I think a lot of women do want to be recognized as more than just a mother or a head of a house, like the matriarch of the house. And so those are some thoughts on COVID-19. I would like to tie it all back into the subject of women. Where are we today? I think maybe this would apply again to Libya, where you have different states, different realities on the ground, and women without any real representation. In Yemen's case, the UN supported a National Peace Dialogue Conference, where they really took into consideration everything, and I literally mean everything, to kind of draft and write the super impressive constitution that we have not had a chance to vote, to have referendum on. It has not passed yet. Yemen's previous constitution, in all fairness, was not that bad. It had some really great articles in there, except it did not forbid the marriages of child marriages. It did not forbid child marriages, and it did not protect women as it should. And one of the issues that was a really, really major hot topic for discussion while they were rewriting the constitution was also around the age of consent for women and the age of marriage. And I think that's going to be something that our region is going to continue to struggle with, the MENA region, because I think the idea of women's bodies and sexuality, and the idea of the fact that we need to discipline and monitor these bodies, is going to continue to be a struggle. But the constitution that they came up with was quite impressive. However, even if this constitution comes into play, the reality always dictates. And what the reality is telling me right now is that you have religious extremists ruling and fighting on the ground who don't want to share power, not just with women, but any group that is outside of their own. It tells you that the future is a little bit bleak. And if you have a wonderful constitution without the ability to enforce the law, without an entire system working to protect that document, you really have nothing. And so I'm sorry to end on a bleak note, but it is a quite realistic note that we should perhaps reflect on as we, probably in the next few months and years, keep shifting our focus and attention from one disaster to the next.
Thanks a lot, Sama, because that really also links with what will be the fourth block, which I wanted if we could talk about the political agendas and how the risks of backlash. We were talking about that also before it was mentioned, no? How, and it's what you were saying about it doesn't matter if it's in the constitution, if the reality is different. And we have certain groups that are pushing, and we have some either be it religious extremism, very conservative movements, or extreme right in other parts of the world. There are some trends that are pushing backwards the agenda for gender equality, and not only MENA, it's all around the world. So so I don't know if we are a bit out of time, but I don't know if any of you want to comment upon those issues before going to questions from the public about the issue of the how gender, the issue of political agenda and the different risks of going backwards in not only as they said in constitution of the laws, but also in the implementation of law, and how that can be, what are the perspectives for that for the future. I don't know if any of you want to mention about it. Asma also mentioned about that on the government in Libya. I don't know if Lina, you want to mention something about that.
Sure. I'd love to save time for questions, but just to say, what happens in politics and in policy and on paper tends to translate very poorly or not at all in practice. So, the challenge of legislative reform or whatever, eliminating discriminatory laws, of which we have plenty, tends to take a very long time to reach the ground where it matters the most. So, sometimes these things remain on paper and have very little impact on the lives of women and girls. So, that's a little bit of a cynical point of view, but at the same time, it's still important to do it and to, tackle the situation from all levels. But at the same time, we speak about women's representation in political space, which is absolutely important. And I am in favor of temporary measures and quotas, all of these things. But also women's bodies don't necessarily mean power for women. So how do you create the enabling environment in any kind of political setting for women to be able to speak, to have voice, to make choices, to not just be female bodies occupying the seats. And at the same time, even those female bodies, who are they? What are their politics? What are their perspectives? Are they feminist or not? And can men also be advocates for equality and take on feminist perspectives? Yes, they can. In the Arab region, do they? No, they don't. Would we like to see that? Certainly. I think we'll keep fighting until we do. And I, for one, would love to retire, but it seems I will never be out of a job. With the rate that we're going, like I said, over 150 years until equality, I don't plan on living all that long. And I hope you all will dig me from the grave and give me some updates. Let me know when we finally won, because I need to believe that we will.
We all need. I don't know, maybe you want to add something on this.
Yeah, just saying we will. I'm sure 200 years ago, women were like, we have to have the right to vote. And not all of them saw it happening. So I think it will. I firmly believe in that, I guess, possibly as a way to be able to continue to do this work. I think you raise an important issue, and that there is a backlash, not just in the region, I think globally, and a contestation. And why does that happen? We've talked about structures not working. We've talked about systems broken. We've talked about so much change continuously happening, either accelerated by conflict or war, or by governments changing. There's also been a massive leap in the women's rights agenda. So many accomplishments, globally speaking, not in the region. And so what you have is you have conservatives who are apprehensive of change, who do not know what change has, or who think that what we had before was better. So you have transnational, in fact, actors on all levels who would like to see the patriarchal family norms to continue to exist. So in the past few months, 3 countries withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, and 2 of those are in Europe. So it's a massive issue that the Libyan government, of course, is not doing any better. We, through advocacy, the peace process, or the political, actually, it wasn't the peace process, the political talks went quite well with the inclusion of women, and women did an amazing job to ensure that the government, the transitional government, will have more women. With, for the first time ever in Libya, have 5 ministries that are allocated to women, including the Ministry of Law, the Minister of Law, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, are females. But as Lina has said, does that translate onto what women need actually on the ground? Often not, because you don't just want women in a position. You want a woman with the skills, with the agenda, with the mindset to implement policies that are gender to improve the gender agenda. And so it's a struggle, and it will continue to be a contestation, to be honest, because it's a power dynamic thing, right? So it's not like other social issues. This is exactly related to people in power not wanting, as Sama said, share it or do anything with it, and us as women disempowered, wanting to say, well, you have to give up your privileges because we want to share it with you. It's a difficult social process that will continue to happen for years.
Thanks a lot, Asma. We'll keep that idea that it's a continuous social process that keeps going, as part of this power dynamic and this struggle we are in. So we just have maybe 10 minutes for questions. Let me just take some, let's see if there are some questions from the public. At least we have 2 questions from Karim Hauser, which you have been in contact with. Thanks, Karim, for helping us to gather our 3 panelists. And he translated us. First, this question is about one is about it's a bit also in relation to this idea of the backlash, or that we were mentioning it, is did the Arab Spring help in any way to create grassroots dynamics that happened some kind of change, or on the contrary has generated the backlash by the patriarchal old regime? Is what also Lina was mentioning, was responding to them some of the consequences of international aid or intervention in Afghanistan. So will any of you want to respond on that, or you have any comment on that? The impact of the Arab Spring in that sense, either in creating grassroots dynamics that meant change, or the opposite, generating some reactions against from the patriarchal regime.
I can take that at
Okay,
that question. In 2011, I think the world watched in awe, where a woman broke stereotypes of what women can do in the region. In Yemen's case, women went to protests, to camps, and I remember there was a big high around the idea that women can stay out late and can go to these spaces where men are participating equally, and their families are not stopping them from going there. And a lot of women went and had actually slept at the Change Square in camps. And so there was this moment of, I think the 2011 revolution, what it did, there's a moment of suspending norms, suspending cultural norms, but it was very quickly that cultural norms reorganized themselves and managed the new reality. So there was a new reality. Women had freedom, in a sense, had a voice. They were excited about it. And then there was political parties learning how to use that moment to their advantage and restoring that balance of power back into normalcy. And by that, for example, I mean that women were such a key component of being the protesters on the streets, to then, have incidents reported of women protesting at the Change Square only to be beaten by men, by sticks, by taking them off stage. This intersectionality of identity, to be a woman does not mean that you are going to fight for women's rights. And what happened very quickly in the Change Square is that a lot of the women that had voices worked for political parties and started working for agendas that were in line with a political party's interest, not in line with the interest of women as a group per se. And so very quickly, we had women continue to participate in these protests. However, the women who were independent, the women who were fighting for women's rights, were marginalized compared to the women who were able to be absorbed by larger political parties who fought for rights that men wanted represented. And as a matter of fact, Yemen's revolution ended up having a woman Nobel Peace Prize winner because of how much women participated in the protest process. Now, of course, from the from the revolution, we had the birth of Yemen's National Dialogue Conference, which is a UN facilitated process that was supposed to save Yemen from war. So we had a Yemeni transitional government, a consensus government that was created. The idea was that if you bring people from different parties, and then you have this national dialogue conference, you can safely transition Yemen from this moment of protest and revolution to a peace process. Of course, looking at the war today, you can tell that strategy did not work. Yemen is now in war, and the parties that were involved in the Yemen National Dialogue Conference are in fact fighting each other today. Yemen's president, who was meant to be a transitional president for just 2 years, is still president today of Yemen, ruling from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So the situation kind of got muddled up. But what happened to women here? In the consensus government, there were women ministers in that government. And of course, the ministries that they give women continue to be human rights or social services. We have not seen a woman in Yemen who's Minister of Defense or Minister of Foreign Affairs or Minister of something, finance, anything that's really impactful to Yemeni society. So it continues to be this, we're giving women seats, but it's still marginalized power somehow. And then in Yemen's national dialogue, they really made sure to have a quota in there and to have women representation of at least 18% in all the committees, and of having their voices involved and of empowering them. Fast forward to today, there are no women in government. There are not many women protesting anymore because of how the realities are on the ground. There's no room for that. And then you also you have these women who were part of the National Dialogue Conference struggling to be part of a peace process, being pushed out and not allowed to be included. So the Arab Spring was this moment of, I would say it was a high. It was a collective euphoria for people. It was a possibility. It was grabbing at something that people wanted that got crushed very, very, very early on in the revolution. It did not last very long. And then, of course, there were many academics who came to write about the woman's the woman's role in this movement. What does it mean? And I think we have to take it with a grain of salt what happened. And I feel very sad to say that it was crushed very quickly, and that today we're facing the opposite reality. However, a lot of the revolutionaries who participated in the 2011 revolution would say that the revolution is still ongoing. And so for that, I would like to have that optimism and to think that that's possible. But whatever happened during the war takes us at least 30 years back.
Yeah, speaking of backlash, 30 years on time. That's a lot. Thanks a lot for your comments, Sama. Although we keep the positive idea that is as Mas said, a continuous process of change or revolutionary movement. Let's hope it will continue, or we will see some advances in the future. We have another question also from Karim, who is a bit in relation to, you mentioned also this idea of that whether the women were pushed out of power later, or if they were included at a certain point of the process, they were included in the government. It was always a marginalized power. It was kind of, they were given these seats, but they were always like we know this kind of female seats. So in that sense, this leads me to another question, which is about what maybe you can give us your opinion about the use of quotas. It's a very specific question about, are quotas in political positions useful in that sense, or just in very specific contexts? Do you have, what is your opinion about that? Any of you wants to answer the question, or about quotas? I guess it's political quotas, Lina. No? Sorry.
You already heard my speech on quotas, which you so that's why I'm saying I will allow others to share their thoughts.
Okay.
Well, I
So
can
anyway,
say very quickly that that quotas alone do not work. You do need quotas in contexts where you do know that women would not get the seats because of legal and social and cultural impediments to the process, because people simply would not vote for them. But you need to have also well, not an environment, but you need to also have conditions for the quota to be able to work. Because what happens when you have a quota, we had a quota in 2012, we were successful in getting the 30% quota, and the political parties completely wrecked it because they managed to use it to their advantage. And so then you had these seats taken by women implementing agendas of political parties, as Sama has said. And it's part also an inexperience of political process in Libya. We've had elections in 2012 for only the second time in the life of Libyans, with 60 years in between. We've had a very particular socialist system where there's no voting or that sort of process. And so yeah, in part, I would say there is an inexperience of working on that. But it's a learning curve, I would say that I would have quotas for a certain period of time, but I wouldn't have them forever. I would ensure that they are there for a number of years and have conditions for them. But it's the same, not just for women. I would say it's the same for linguistic and ethnic minorities in the country, because we know that they would not get seats, and we've had experience with that with the Constitutional Drafting Committee, that ethnic groups managed to have 3-4 seats up against 54, 56 Arabs who would vote them out on every basically essential issue. So it has to be particular, it has to be well designed in order for it to work, and it should not be a crutch, it should not be something that you rely on to have women in political power. It's a first push, but then you continue to work both as a government and civil society organization to change the political environment so that you don't need it always. That's my opinion on quotas.
If I may just
yeah, please,
on the subject. So I just wanted to actually correct myself. When I was speaking, I said that the woman quota in the national dialogue was 18%. It was actually a staggering 30%, which is quite impressive to previous quotas that Yemen has had. I think the quota is a double-edged sword. It's a way to get women a seat at the table, and even though they're not entirely, you don't get the guarantee of them representing women's rights, you still do get a woman at the table. And to be honest, I think that even compared to the West, when women come to power, they don't necessarily represent women's rights and champion for them. And we've seen that with UK women prime ministers and Israel prime minister who are women. They don't necessarily come to champion for women's rights. They come to represent the interest of their nation and to actually, in a sense, represent their policies in a more masculine, strong, forceful manner in order to earn a seat at the table. And we still see it to this day. I mean, the last time we saw Hillary Clinton's, there were so many articles about how she has to dress a certain way in order to earn respect and be taken seriously. And so this issue is not just limited to the MENA region. And sometimes when I think about the solutions, is the solution to have an all-woman political party that just cares about women's interests? Is that the real way to have representatives in government who then would fight for women's rights? I don't think that is the solution, because women are not just mothers or just women. It's a bit more complex than that. But the idea is that also the men in power have to understand the importance of the role of women and to understand that they are, in fact, an equal partner in society. And in order to do that, you have to tap into education and into the psyche of that culture. What is the gaze that men look at women with, and what is the gaze that women look at themselves as? How do we redefine these, the way that we look at women, and how does this redefinition allow us to have a different approach towards women issues?
Thanks a lot, Sama. Yeah, indeed, it will give us another some thoughts to do. And I was thinking, I'm just thinking that maybe we could organize something about this idea of how we women see ourselves, no, and this idea of we have worked a lot about the issues of identity, in different communities. It will be interesting to see a debate on women's identity, how we perceive and how it's changing. But let's leave it here because we have been a bit more. We have spent more than what we expected. We have been an hour and a half, and think that we don't want to use more of your time. And it has been really a pleasure to see the online table with you. I hope next time we will be able to do it here in Casa Árabe in Madrid or in Córdoba. And I really thank you for making time in your different agendas and in your work to be. It's very important for us that you share your experience, and it's a way for us of raising your voices. So at least this will be in our YouTube channel, and we continue debating on this issue, and it is giving us a lot of thought also for developing these issues in the future. So thanks a lot again, and really wish you all the best in your different works and projects. And thanks to all those following us. To finish up, I would just like to remind that about the new exhibition being open in our headquarters in Madrid about women in the Sahel, by Spanish artists whose works collect the landscapes and scenes in Timbuktu, the local culture and the women works there, especially in this Guna Tier Association, which is an entity which is indeed very active in projects empowering women and sustainability in the region, the two big words that we were talking about today. So I will switch to Spanish now. Gracias a todos de nuevo, a los que nos seguís hoy. Anunciaros que está ya abierta en nuestra sede de Casa Árabe en Madrid la exposición de Mujeres del Sahel. Estará abierta hasta el 25 de julio y que es una exposición de una artista española, Irene López de Castro, cuyas obras recogen paisajes y escenas de Tombuctú, ciudad en la que ha pasado largas temporadas familiarizándose con los elementos de la cultura local y sobre todo con el trabajo de las mujeres en una asociación, Uratier, que es una entidad particularmente activa en proyectos justos de lo que es empoderamiento de las mujeres en materia de conservación medioambiental. Con esto terminamos y seguimos. Buenas tardes a todos y muchas gracias.